If my suppressant fails today, I'm screwed. The thought hit Ethan Cole before his alarm even finished buzzing, sharp and immediate, like his body already knew something was wrong. He lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling of his tiny downtown apartment, the faint hum of traffic outside mixing with the steady thump of his pulse. Too fast, too loud, too noticeable. That wasn't normal. Not for him. Not after 15 years of strict suppressant schedules, carefully measured doses, and a life built around control. Ethan pushed himself up, running a hand through his dark hair, already slightly damp at the temples. It's nothing, he muttered, voice rough, like if he said it out loud, it would become true. It had to be. Because omegas didn't just lose control. Not the careful ones. Not the ones who followed every rule. Not him. He reached for the small amber bottle on his nightstand, fingers tightening around it just a little too hard. Empty. His stomach dropped. No, that wasn't possible. He'd refilled it 2 days ago. He shook it anyway. Nothing. A hollow rattle that wasn't there. Okay. He whispered, forcing a breath in, then out. Okay. I'll just grab more on the way. Except he already knew the nearest pharmacy wouldn't open for another 3 hours, and he had a meeting in 45 minutes, and missing that meeting wasn't an option. Not when your boss was Alexander Hayes. Ethan swung his legs over the side of the bed, heart picking up again at the thought of him. Alexander Hayes. CEO. Alpha. Untouchable. The kind of man who walked into a room and made everyone else instinctively straighten their posture, lower their voice, exist a little quieter. Ethan hated that his body reacted too. He always had. Even through layers of chemical suppression, something deep inside him still recognized that presence, that pressure, that quiet, controlled dominance. It made no sense. It made everything worse. Just get through the morning, Ethan told himself as he pulled on his shirt, fingers fumbling slightly at the buttons. You've done it before. But this time felt different. His skin was too sensitive. The fabric brushed his collarbone, and he flinched. His breath hitched for no reason. His thoughts kept slipping, like they couldn't hold steady. Wrong. Everything felt wrong. By the time he stepped into the office, the cool blast of air conditioning should have grounded him. It didn't. If anything, it made the contrast sharper, the awareness worse. People moved around him, voices blending into background noise, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the normal rhythm of a Monday morning. Ethan kept his head down, walking faster than usual, trying to ignore the way his senses seemed amplified. Then it happened. He stopped mid-step, just froze. Because suddenly, unmistakably, he could smell it. Not his. Not exactly. Something deeper. Warmer. Stronger. It cut through everything else like it didn't belong in the same air. Ethan's throat went dry. No, that wasn't Cole. The voice came from behind him, low, calm, controlled, and way too close. Ethan didn't turn around. He couldn't, because his body had already reacted before his brain could catch up. His pulse spiked. His breath hitched. And for the first time in 15 years, the suppressants weren't there to stop it. Alexander Hayes did not repeat himself. He did not need to. The single word hung in the air like a command, quiet but absolute. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, just enough to try to steady the sudden rush under his skin, then forced himself to turn around. Big mistake. Too close. That was the first thought that hit him, sharp and immediate. Alexander stood less than 2 feet away, tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, not a single detail out of place, like control had been stitched into every seam. His expression was neutral, almost bored, but his eyes were not. They were focused, directly on Ethan. Assessing. Ethan swallowed, the motion suddenly difficult, his throat dry for no reason he could explain out loud. Mr. Hayes, he managed, voice tighter than usual. Too tight. He hated that. He hated that he could hear it himself. Alexander tilted his head slightly, a subtle movement, but it felt like everything shifted with it. You are late, he said, calm measured. Ethan blinked. Late. Right. Time. Normal things. I am not, Ethan said quickly, then immediately regretted how fast that sounded. He glanced toward the large wall clock across the office floor. 8:58. 2 minutes early. I am not late, he corrected, slower this time, forcing control back into his tone. Alexander did not look at the clock. He did not need to. Then why? He said, voice dropping just enough to make Ethan's Pulse spike again. Do you smell like you are? Ethan froze. Everything in him went still. Not physically. Internally. Like his body forgot how to process that sentence. Smell. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Alpha. Of course he would notice. Ethan's fingers curled slightly at his sides, nails pressing into his palm just enough to ground him. I do not know what you mean, he said, each word placed carefully, like stepping across thin ice. Alexander watched him for a second longer. Too long. Then his gaze flickered, just briefly, down Ethan's frame and back up again, and something in his expression shifted. Not softer. Not warmer. Just sharper. My office, Alexander said, turning without waiting for a response. Ethan's stomach dropped. No, that was not part of the plan. The plan was to survive the morning, avoid him, get to a pharmacy, fix this. This was not that. Now, Mr. Cole. Ethan moved before he could overthink it. Of course he did. Everyone did when Alexander Hayes gave an order like that. The walk to the office felt longer than usual. Every step louder. Every breath more noticeable. The hallway narrowed, the glass walls closing in, the sound of the main floor fading behind them until it was just the quiet hum of the building and the echo of his own pulse. Wrong. Still wrong. When the office door closed behind them with a soft click, the sound felt final. Sealed. Ethan stood near the entrance, not trusting himself to move any closer, but Alexander had already crossed the room, setting a file down on his desk with precise, controlled movements. Come here, he said, not looking up. Ethan hesitated. Just for a second. His body did not like the distance. That was the problem. That was the worst part. Because standing this far away felt worse. He took a step forward. Then another. Too aware. Too conscious of everything. The air. The space. Him. Alexander finally looked up. What did you take this morning? He asked. Straight to the point. No hesitation. Ethan's breath caught. Nothing, he said automatically. That was the truth. And also the problem. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, like he could see right through that answer. Exactly, he said quietly. And that was when Ethan realized this was not a question. It was a conclusion. The word hung between them, heavy and undeniable, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deep in his chest where logic usually lived. Exactly. Of course Alexander knew. Of course he could tell. Ethan let out a slow breath, trying to steady himself, but it came out uneven anyway, his control slipping in small, barely noticeable cracks that felt anything but small to him. It is just a delay, Ethan said quickly, grasping for something that sounded reasonable, something that sounded like him. I will get a new dose during lunch, and it will be fine. He nodded once, like that settled it, like that closed the conversation, but Alexander did not move. Did not blink. Did not accept that answer. No, Alexander said simply. One word. Final. Ethan's stomach twisted. No, he repeated, the word catching slightly on the way out. Alexander stepped closer. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just deliberate. And somehow that made it worse. Every inch of distance that disappeared between them felt louder than the last. Ethan's breath shortened, his shoulders tightening without permission. You are not going to last until lunch, Alexander continued, his voice low, steady, controlled in a way Ethan suddenly envied. Your scent is already unstable. Scent. The word hit harder this time. Ethan's fingers curled again, pressing into his palm. Grounding, grounding, grounding. I said I will handle it. Ethan insisted, but it sounded weaker now, thinner, like the words were losing structure the same way his body was. Alexander stopped in front of him, close enough that Ethan could feel the shift in air, the subtle warmth that did not belong to him. Too close. He should step back. He did not. Could not. His feet felt rooted, like moving would make everything worse. You have been handling it, Alexander said, and there was something different in his tone now. Not softer. Not kind. Just certain. For years. Ethan's chest tightened. Yes, he said, sharper this time. Defensive, because that was the one thing he could hold on to. And it has worked. Alexander's gaze held his, unwavering. Has it? The question landed quiet. Dangerous. Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because suddenly, standing here, with his pulse too fast, and his senses too sharp, and his control slipping in ways it never had before, the answer did not feel as solid as it used to. You are shaking, Alexander said. Ethan froze. He had not noticed. Not consciously. But Now that it was said, he could feel it, subtle tremors running through his fingers, his arms, his breath uneven in a way that refused to settle. I am not, Ethan replied automatically, even as his hand twitched at his side, betraying him. Alexander did not argue. He just reached out. Not to grab, not to force, just a light, controlled touch against Ethan's wrist. And that was enough. Ethan's breath hitched sharply, the reaction immediate and completely out of proportion, like his body had been waiting for that exact point of contact without telling him. His thoughts scattered. Completely. Heat rushed under his skin, not overwhelming, not consuming, but present in a way it had not been in years. Wrong. This was wrong. Do not. Ethan said quickly, pulling his wrist back like the contact had burned, even though it had not. Not like that. Worse. Alexander's eyes darkened slightly, his expression tightening for the first time. That is exactly the problem, he said quietly. Ethan shook his head, stepping back now, finally breaking the space between them, even though the distance did not fix anything. It just made the absence louder. I am fine, Ethan insisted, even as his voice wavered, even as his breath refused to steady. I just need the medication. Alexander watched him for a long moment. Then, very calmly, he said, your body does not agree with you. Ethan's chest rose, fell, too fast, too shallow. He could feel it now. Everything. The imbalance. The instability. The way his control was not gone, but slipping, piece by piece, like something underneath was pushing back for the first time in years. You need to sit down, Alexander added. Ethan let out a strained breath, almost a laugh, except there was nothing funny about it. I am not collapsing in your office, he said, trying to force some normalcy into the situation, something light, something controlled. But even as he said it, his vision flickered slightly at the edges. Just for a second. Enough. Alexander did not react outwardly, but he moved again, stepping closer, his presence steady, grounded, unshaken. Ethan, he said, and this time it was not a command. It was something else, something lower, something that made Ethan's pulse spike for a completely different reason. You are not in control right now. Ethan's breath caught, because that was the one thing he had built his entire life around. Control. And for the first time, he was not sure he still had it. Control. The word echoed in Ethan's head like something fragile, something already cracking under pressure. He forced a breath in, then out, but it did not steady him. Nothing did. Not the cool air in the office. Not the distance he had just created between them. Not even the years of training his body to obey. I am fine, Ethan said again, quieter this time, like repeating it might anchor him back into something familiar. It did not. His pulse still raced, uneven and persistent, like it refused to listen. His skin felt too tight, too aware, every small sensation amplified in a way that made it impossible to ignore. He hated it. He hated how unfamiliar his own body suddenly felt. Alexander did not move. He did not interrupt. He just watched, his gaze steady, tracking every shift, every breath, every subtle sign Ethan could no longer hide. You are trying to force it down, Alexander said, voice calm. But there was something firmer underneath it now. Not judgment, not impatience, just certainty. Ethan let out a small, strained laugh, shaking his head. That is how it works, he replied, a little sharper, because that was what he knew, what he had always known. That is how I have always managed it. Alexander's expression did not change, but his eyes did. Slightly. Enough for Ethan to notice. Managed, Alexander repeated, like he was testing the word, weighing it. Then he stepped closer again. Not fast. Never fast. But deliberate enough that Ethan felt it immediately, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. Too close again. Too aware again. Ethan's breath hitched, barely audible, but not invisible. Not to him. Not to Alexander. You are not managing anything right now, Alexander said quietly. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight, his thoughts slipping again, harder this time, harder to hold. I just need time, Ethan insisted, even though the words felt weaker now, less convincing even to himself. You need support, Alexander corrected. The word landed differently. Support. Not control. Not suppression. Something else. Ethan's chest tightened at that. A different kind of pressure, unfamiliar in a way that made him uneasy. I do not need, he started, But the sentence broke halfway through when his vision blurred for just a second, a flicker that made him blink hard. Too much. Everything was too much. He reached out instinctively, his hand brushing the edge of the desk behind him to steady himself, fingers gripping the surface tighter than necessary. Alexander moved immediately, not abruptly, not forcefully, just closer, present, grounded. Sit, Alexander said again, softer this time, but no less firm. Ethan hesitated. Pride, habit, control, all of it pushed back for one more second. Then his knees weakened just enough to make the decision for him. He sat. The chair caught him, solid and real, and for a moment he focused on that, on the physical weight of it, on something stable. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers still trembling slightly, and he clenched them into loose fists to hide it. It did not help. Nothing was helping. Look at me, Alexander said. Ethan did not want to. He did anyway, because something in that tone made it impossible not to. Their eyes met, and for a moment everything else faded, the noise in Ethan's head quieting just enough to feel something else underneath it. Steady, controlled, not his, Alexander's. Breathe, Alexander instructed, voice low, even, like he was setting a rhythm Ethan's body could follow. Ethan inhaled, too fast, exhaled, uneven. Again, Alexander said. Ethan tried again, slower this time. Not perfect, but closer. Alexander watched him carefully, adjusting nothing, forcing nothing, just there, solid and unshaken in a way Ethan suddenly needed more than he wanted to admit. Your body is not failing, Alexander said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less like a command and more like a statement meant only for him. It is reacting. Ethan's brows pulled together slightly, confusion mixing with the overwhelming awareness still running through him. To what? He asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Alexander did not answer immediately. He held Ethan's gaze, steady, unreadable for a second longer than necessary. Then he said, very simply, to me. Ethan's breath caught, completely, and this time, he could not pretend it was just the lack of suppressants. The words settled into Ethan's chest like a quiet detonation, not loud, not violent, but impossible to ignore once it landed. To me. His breath stalled halfway in, his body going still in a way that felt louder than any reaction he could have made. That is not he. Started, but the sentence dissolved before it could form, because even as he tried to deny it, his body betrayed him again. His pulse spiked, sharper this time, more focused, not random, not scattered, directed, toward him. Ethan looked away first, his gaze dropping to the edge of the desk, to anything that was not Alexander Hayes standing in front of him like a fixed point his body had already chosen. That does not make sense, Ethan said, quieter now, like he was trying to convince himself more than anything else. It is just the lack of suppressants. Alexander did not move. If that were true, he said evenly, you would be reacting to everyone. Ethan's fingers tightened against his knees. That was true. It should have been chaotic, unfocused, overwhelming in every direction. But it was not. It was contained, centered, and that realization made his chest tighten for a completely different reason. This is temporary, Ethan insisted, forcing the words out, even as his voice lost some of its steadiness. Once I take the medication again, everything will go back to normal. Normal. The word felt thin now, fragile, like it might not hold the same meaning it used to. Alexander studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp but not unkind, just aware. And if it does not, he asked. Ethan's head snapped up slightly. It will, he said immediately. Too fast. Too certain. Because the alternative was not something he was ready to face. Alexander did not argue. He just stepped closer again, slower this time, giving Ethan enough space to react, to pull away if he needed to. Ethan did not move. Not because he did not want to. Because something in him refused to. The distance closed to a careful, measured space, close enough for Ethan to feel it again, that subtle shift in the air, that grounding presence that seemed to pull everything else into focus and blur it out at the same time. His breath hitched, softer this time, almost involuntary. You are focusing on control, Alexander said quietly, his voice lower now, less like instruction and more like observation. But your body is not asking for control. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. Then what is it asking for? The question came out before he could stop it, softer than anything he had said so far, edged with something unfamiliar. Alexander's gaze held his, steady, unshaken. Balance, he said. The word lingered, settling differently than everything else. Not force, not loss, something in between. Ethan's brows pulled together slightly, confusion threading through the overwhelming awareness still running under his skin. I do not know how to do that, he admitted, the words quieter now, more honest than he intended. Alexander's expression shifted, just slightly, the edge of something softer breaking through the constant control. That is because you have never been allowed to learn, he said. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, like some of the tension had finally found a place to go, even if it was temporary. So what happens now, he asked. Alexander did not answer right away. Instead, he reached out again, slower this time, giving Ethan every chance to stop him. Ethan watched the movement, his breath catching again, his instincts split between retreat and something else he could not fully name. The touch came to rest lightly against Ethan's wrist once more, steady, controlled, nothing forceful, nothing overwhelming. And still, Ethan felt it. Not like before. Not sharp. Not chaotic. This time it was grounding. His breath steadied. Just a little. His pulse slowed. Not completely, but enough to notice. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. The change immediate and undeniable. You feel that? Alexander said, not a question. Ethan nodded before he could stop himself. Yes, he admitted, the word barely above a whisper. Alexander's grip did not tighten, did not shift. He just stayed there, a constant point Ethan's body seemed to recognize without explanation. Then we start there, Alexander said quietly. And for the first time since this morning began, Ethan was not entirely sure that going back to normal was what he wanted anymore. The contact did not break. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. Alexander did not pull away, did not tighten his grip, did not do anything except remain steady, like he had decided that this was the point Ethan needed and nothing more. And somehow, that made it worse. Or better. Ethan could not tell anymore. His breathing, which had been uneven for what felt like hours, began to settle into something closer to a rhythm. Not perfect, not controlled, but not falling apart either. He focused on it, on the slow inhale, the quieter exhale, the way the tension in his shoulders eased just a fraction. With each breath. This is not supposed to work like this, Ethan said after a moment, his voice low, still carrying the edge of disbelief that had not faded since everything began. Alexander did not look surprised. It is not supposed to work the way you were taught, he replied calmly. Ethan frowned slightly, his gaze flickering down to where Alexander's hand still rested against his wrist, then back up again. There are protocols, Ethan said, almost reflexively, like he was reciting something ingrained. Regulation. Suppression is the safest method. The words sounded practiced, rehearsed, and suddenly, very far away from what he was actually feeling. Alexander's expression did not soften, but there was something quieter in it now, something that acknowledged the weight behind those words without agreeing with them. Safe does not always mean stable, Alexander said. Ethan's chest tightened again, but this time it was not the same sharp panic as before. It was something more complicated. It has kept me functional, Ethan replied, but there was hesitation now, a crack in the certainty that had always been there. Alexander's thumb shifted slightly, just a small movement against Ethan's wrist, barely noticeable, but enough to draw Ethan's focus right back to the contact. Functional, Alexander repeated, like he was testing the word again. Or controlled. Ethan inhaled slowly, the distinction settling deeper than he expected. Controlled. That was the goal. That had always been the goal. But sitting here now, with his pulse finally slowing under someone else's steady presence instead of a chemical response, the word did not feel as solid as it used to. I cannot rely on this, Ethan said, though the words came out quieter than intended, less like a rejection and more like uncertainty. Alexander's gaze did not waver. You are not relying on me, he said. You are responding. Ethan blinked, the difference subtle but significant enough to make him pause. Responding. Not dependent. Not weak. Just reacting. Naturally. The thought made his chest tighten again, but not from panic. From something else. Something unfamiliar. And if this gets worse? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper now, because that was the real fear. Not this moment. What came after? Alexander did not hesitate. Then I will be here, he said simply. No hesitation. No condition. Just certainty. Ethan stared at him, something in his expression shifting as the words settled in. He was not used to that. Not used to someone stating something like that without hesitation, without distance, without the careful neutrality he had built his life around. You cannot guarantee that, Ethan said, though the protest lacked its usual strength. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to show he had heard it. I do not make statements I cannot uphold, he replied. The room fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that was not empty, but full of everything left unsaid. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering further, his body no longer fighting itself with the same intensity as before. The tension was still there. The awareness was still there. But it was no longer overwhelming. Not like it had been. What happens when I leave this room? Ethan asked after a moment. That was the real test. Not here. Not with this controlled environment. Outside. In the open. Without this steady point anchoring him. Alexander finally withdrew his hand, slowly, deliberately, and Ethan felt the absence immediately. Not a collapse. Not a loss of control. But noticeable. Enough to matter. Then we do not let it get that far, Alexander said. Ethan's brows pulled together slightly. We, he repeated. Alexander's expression remained composed, but there was something firm in his tone now, something that left no room for misinterpretation. You are not handling this alone anymore. Ethan's breath caught again, softer this time, less panic, more realization. Because for the first time, that did not feel like a loss of control. It felt like something else entirely. The space between them felt different the moment Alexander stepped back. Not empty, not safe, just noticeable. Ethan became aware of it instantly, the absence of that steady presence pulling his focus in a way that made his chest tighten again, though not as sharply as before. It lingered instead, like a quiet reminder his body refused to ignore. Alone, Ethan repeated under his breath, testing the word, as if saying it might bring back the version of himself that had always depended on it. It did not. His fingers flexed slightly against his thighs, no longer trembling as badly, but not entirely steady either. Progress. Maybe. Or just temporary. He was not sure anymore. Alexander had already moved back toward his desk, composed as ever, the shift in proximity barely reflected in his posture. If anything, he looked exactly the same as he had when this started. Controlled, measured, unaffected. Ethan hated how much that grounded him. You cannot just decide that, Ethan said finally, lifting his gaze again, forcing some structure back into his voice. This is not a shared problem. The words sounded more like him. Logical, clear, familiar. Alexander did not look up from the file he had picked up again, flipping it open with a quiet, precise motion. It became a shared problem the moment you lost control in my office, he said calmly. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. I did not lose control, he argued, even though the statement felt weaker than it should have. Alexander raised a brow, finally looking at him again. Not skeptical, just aware. You almost did, he corrected. The distinction landed heavier than Ethan expected. Almost. Not yet. That mattered. It had to matter. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the motion more restless than usual. This is temporary, he said again, softer this time. Less like a defense and more like something he needed to believe. It has to be. Alexander closed the file. Then we confirm that, he replied. Ethan frowned slightly. Confirm? Alexander stepped around the desk again, not closing the distance entirely this time, but enough to keep Ethan's attention locked on him. You leave the building, he said. Without suppressants. Without me. Ethan's chest tightened immediately. The idea alone made his pulse spike again. A subtle but undeniable reaction. That is not necessary, Ethan said quickly. It is, Alexander countered, his tone leaving little room for argument. Because if you cannot maintain stability outside of this room, then your situation is not temporary. Ethan hesitated, just for a second, because he knew what that meant. He knew what it implied, and he was not ready to accept that yet. And if I can, Ethan asked, quieter now, more measured. Alexander's gaze held his, steady and unshaken. Then you proceed as you always have. Simple, direct, logical. It should have reassured him. It did not. Because the alternative still lingered in the space between them, unspoken but very real. Ethan stood slowly, testing his balance, his breath, the way his body felt now compared to 20 minutes ago. Better. Not perfect, but better. He could do this. He had to. Fine, Ethan said, straightening his posture, forcing control back into his movements. I will go. Alexander nodded once, as if that had always been the expected outcome. I will be here, he added, the words quiet but deliberate. Ethan paused at that, just for a fraction of a second, before turning toward the door. The handle felt cool under his fingers. Normal. Grounding. He pulled it open, stepping out into the hallway, the familiar hum of the office returning instantly. Sound. Movement. People. Everything he knew. Ethan took a breath. Then another. And for a moment, it held. His control. His balance. His normal. Until someone passed too close behind him, and suddenly his senses sharpened again, the world tilting just slightly off-center. His breath hitched. Subtle, but enough. Ethan stilled, his hand tightening at his side as he forced himself not to react, not to panic, not to draw attention. Not here. Not now. You are fine, he told himself under his breath. But his pulse was already climbing again. And this time, there was no steady presence beside him to anchor it. The shift was immediate. Subtle, but immediate. Ethan felt it the second the distance between him and Alexander became more than just a few feet. The hallway air was different. Thinner. Louder. Too many scents blending together in a way that made his chest tighten and his focus scatter. He stilled near the doorway, forcing his shoulders to stay relaxed, forcing his breathing to stay even as his pulse ticked upward again, faster, sharper. Not as bad as before, but not stable either. Someone laughed down the hall. A phone rang. Shoes clicked against the polished floor. Normal sounds. Ordinary. And yet every single one of them felt amplified, like his senses were turned just a little too high. Just enough to make everything feel off. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry again. Keep walking, he muttered under his breath. His feet obeyed. One step. Then another. Controlled. Measured. He had done this before. He could do this again. He passed by a group near the conference room, their conversation fading in and out of his awareness, but it was not the words that caught his attention. It was the proximity, the closeness, the subtle shifts in scent as people moved around him. His breath hitched. Just a little. He slowed without meaning to, his body reacting before his mind could correct it. No, not here. Not now. Ethan straightened, forcing his pace forward again, his fingers curling at his sides as he focused on something simple. Walking. Breathing. Step. Step. Inhale. Exhale. It worked. For a moment. Then someone brushed past him. Accidental. Light. Barely there. But it was enough. Ethan froze. The contact was nothing. A passing shoulder, a brief collision of space. But his body reacted like it was something more. His breath caught sharply, his pulse spiking in an instant, his senses flaring again in a way that made his vision blur at the edges for half a second. Too much. Too fast. He inhaled quickly, then again, trying to steady it, trying to push it down the way he always had. It did not respond the same way. It resisted. That was new. That was wrong. You are fine, he whispered, the words quieter now, less convincing. He moved again, faster this time, heading toward the elevators at the end of the hall, needing space, needing distance from the noise, the movement, everything pressing in on him from all sides. The elevator door slid open with a soft chime, and Ethan stepped inside quickly, grateful for the brief isolation. The doors closed. Silence. Or at least, less noise. He leaned back against the cool metal wall, closing his eyes for a second, focusing on his breathing again. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. It helped. A little. His pulse slowed, not completely, but enough to feel the difference. See, he muttered, almost to prove it to himself. You can handle it. The elevator jerked slightly as it began to move, the subtle shift pulling him forward just enough to remind him he was not as steady as he wanted to be. He braced a hand against the wall, grounding himself again, his fingers pressing into the surface as he focused on the sensation. Physical. Real. Not overwhelming. Just something to hold on to. The doors slid open on the lobby level, and the moment they did, the noise hit him again. People. Movement. Voices overlapping. The outside world pressing in from every direction. Ethan stepped out slowly this time, more cautious, more aware of how easily everything had shifted just minutes ago. He made it 3 steps, then 4, and then he stopped, because suddenly, unmistakably, his body reacted again. Not to the crowd, not to the noise, to something else, something specific, familiar. His breath. Caught. Not panic this time. Recognition. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze scanning the space without fully understanding why, until it landed. Across the lobby, near the glass entrance, Alexander Hayes stood there, composed as ever, speaking quietly with someone, his posture relaxed, his presence unmistakable even in a crowded room. Ethan's pulse shifted instantly. Not faster, not chaotic, focused, grounded, like everything inside him had recalibrated the second he saw him. Ethan froze, the realization hitting him all at once. He was not stabilizing on his own. He never had been. The realization did not come gently. It settled in Ethan's chest with a quiet certainty that felt heavier than panic, heavier than fear, because it left no room to deny it. He stood there in the middle of the lobby, people moving around him, voices blending into a dull background hum, but none of it reached him the way it had seconds ago. Everything narrowed, focused. His breathing steadied without effort. His pulse slowed into something even, controlled, almost normal, not because he forced it, because Alexander Hayes was standing across the room. No, Ethan whispered under his breath, the word barely audible, more reflex than belief. He took a step back, like distance might break whatever invisible line had just formed, but nothing changed. The calm remained. His body did not spike, did not falter. It held steady in a way it had not all morning. That was worse, because it confirmed it. Ethan dragged a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing now, not scattered like before, but sharp, focused, trying to make sense of something that refused to fit into anything he had been taught. This was not how it worked. It could not be how it worked. Omegas did not stabilize around a single person like this. Not without bond. Not without something deeper, something permanent, something he had spent his entire life avoiding. It is just coincidence, he muttered, forcing the words out, even as they sounded weak the second they left his mouth. He turned away, deliberately, forcing himself to look at anything else. The front desk, the security station, the glass doors leading out to the street. Anywhere but him. His breath held steady. For 2 seconds. 3. Then it slipped. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just enough. A subtle shift under his skin, a slight increase in his pulse, a quiet return. Of that imbalance he had been fighting all morning. Ethan's jaw tightened. He turned back. Instinct. Immediate. And the moment his eyes landed on Alexander again, it stopped. Not completely, but enough to feel the difference. Enough to make his chest tighten for a completely different reason. This is not normal, Ethan said quietly, the words more grounded now, less denial, more realization. Across the lobby, Alexander's conversation ended. The other man nodded and stepped away, leaving him standing alone for a brief moment. And then his gaze lifted, directly to Ethan, like he had known exactly where to look, like he had been aware of him the entire time. Ethan's breath caught, softer this time, not panic, not resistance, just awareness. Alexander did not react outwardly. No surprise, no confusion, just a slight shift in his posture before he started walking. Straight toward him. Each step measured, controlled, the same way it always was. And yet now, Ethan could feel it before he even got close. The subtle pull, the way his body responded, not with tension, but with something steadier, something that felt dangerously close to relief. Ethan hated that. He hated how immediate it was, how natural it felt, how his body seemed to recognize something his mind was still trying to reject. You followed me, Ethan said when Alexander stopped a few feet away, his voice quieter than intended. Alexander's expression remained composed. I observe, he corrected. Ethan let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. That was not part of the test, he said. Alexander's gaze held his, unwavering. It was the most important part. Ethan frowned, confusion pulling at his features. You said I needed to see if I could stabilize without you, he pointed out. Alexander did not argue. And now you have, he said simply. Ethan stilled. Because that was the problem. He had. And he knew exactly what the result was. His hands curled slightly at his sides, his thoughts finally aligning with what his body had been telling him all along. I cannot, Ethan admitted, the words quiet, but steady. No denial left. No space for it. Alexander studied him for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like that answer had been expected all along. Then we adjust, he said. Ethan's breath caught again, not from instability this time, but from the weight of what that meant. Because adjusting meant change, and change meant letting go of everything he had relied on for years. This is not sustainable, Ethan said, even as the words felt uncertain. Alexander's gaze did not waver. It is, he replied calmly, if you stop fighting it. Ethan looked at him, really looked this time, at the unwavering control, the certainty, the steadiness his body responded to without hesitation. And for the first time, he was not sure if the real problem was losing control, or finally understanding what it actually meant. The word adjust lingered longer than it should have. It followed Ethan even as the noise of the lobby slowly returned, as people passed by and conversations resumed around them, as if the world had decided to continue moving while his own had quietly shifted off balance. He exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was no longer forced, no longer something he had to fight to maintain. That alone was enough to unsettle him. You are asking me to change everything, Ethan said finally, his voice steady but lower, more deliberate, like each word had to be placed carefully now. Alexander did not respond immediately. He watched him, his gaze focused in that same unwavering way that made Ethan feel seen in a way he had never allowed before. I am asking you to stop relying on something that is no longer working, Alexander replied. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. It worked for years, he countered, even though the argument felt thinner with each passing second. Alexander tilted his head just slightly. It suppressed you for years, he corrected. The distinction landed deeper this time. Ethan felt it settle somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere he could not easily ignore. Suppressed. Not stable. Not balanced. Just controlled. That is the point, Ethan said, but the conviction was not as strong as it used to be. Control keeps things predictable. Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly. And predictable means safe? He asked. Ethan hesitated, because the answer should have been yes. It had always been yes. But standing here now, with his body responding in a way that felt more stable than anything the suppressants had ever given him, the word safe did not feel as clear anymore. It means manageable, Ethan said instead. Alexander nodded once, like he accepted the answer without agreeing with it. And how manageable did it feel? 10 minutes ago, he asked. Ethan exhaled, the memory still too recent, too sharp. The loss of balance. The instability. The way everything had slipped so quickly the moment he stepped away. Not very, he admitted quietly. Alexander stepped closer again, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to shift the space between them into something more contained, more controlled. Ethan felt it immediately, the subtle recalibration in his chest, the quiet steadiness returning without effort. He hated how easy it was. This is not dependence, Alexander said, his voice lower now, more precise. This is compatibility. The word hit differently. Ethan's brows pulled together slightly. That implies something else, he said, cautious now, aware of where this could lead. Alexander held his gaze, unflinching. It implies that your body is responding the way it is meant to, he said. Ethan's breath caught, softer this time, less panic, more weight. Meant to. He looked away for a second, his thoughts catching up, trying to reorganize everything he had believed into something that made sense in this moment. You are saying this is natural, Ethan said slowly. Alexander did not hesitate. Yes. The certainty in that single word made something in Ethan's chest tighten again, but not from fear. From realization. Because if this was natural, then everything he had been doing for years had not been. Ethan ran a hand through his hair again, slower this time, less frantic, more thoughtful. And what happens if I refuse? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a question he needed answered. Alexander's expression did not change, but his voice softened just slightly. Then you continue the way you have been, he said, until it stops working again. The answer was simple, too simple, and that was what made it heavier. Ethan nodded once, more to himself than anything else, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting again. And if I do not? He asked. Alexander stepped closer, just enough for Ethan to feel that shift again, that quiet steadiness settling into place without resistance. Then we find a way forward that does not rely on suppression, he said. Ethan's breath slowed again, his body aligning with that presence in a way that no longer felt accidental. It felt consistent, reliable, and that was the part that unsettled him the most. Because for the first time, control did not feel like the only option, and he did not know if he was ready for that. The space between them no longer felt like a question. It felt like a choice. Ethan stood there, the steady rhythm in his chest no longer something he was forcing, no longer something fragile that could break at any second. It held, consistent, quiet, real, and the fact that it only happened like this, only when Alexander was close, only when that presence anchored him, made it impossible to ignore anymore. Compatibility. Ethan repeated under his breath, testing the word again, like it might change meaning if he said it enough times. It did not. It settled deeper instead, threading through everything he had been trying not to see since this morning. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering, not from exhaustion this time, but from something closer to acceptance, even if it was incomplete. You knew, Ethan said suddenly, his gaze lifting sharply back to Alexander. Before today, it was not a question. It was a realization that had been building quietly and finally reached the surface. Alexander did not look surprised. Yes, he said simply. Ethan's brows pulled together, frustration flickering through the steadiness he had just found. And you did not say anything? He asked, his voice tightening slightly, not from instability, but from something more controlled, more intentional. Alexander's gaze remained level. There was nothing to confirm, he replied. Ethan let out a short breath, shaking his head. You were observing, he said, the earlier word returning now with a sharper edge. Alexander inclined his head slightly. I was ensuring that I was not interfering with something that was not mine to influence, he corrected. Ethan stared at him, the answer landing in a way he had not expected. Not possessive, not intrusive, controlled, deliberate, and somehow that made it harder to argue against. And now? Ethan asked, quieter this time. Alexander stepped just slightly closer, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to reinforce that steady point Ethan's body had already aligned with. Now it is no longer theoretical, he said. Ethan's breath slowed again, automatically, his body responding before his thoughts could catch up. He looked down for a second, his hand lifting slightly before stopping mid-motion, like he was unsure what he was reaching for. Then he let it fall again. This changes things, Ethan said, more to himself than anything else. Alexander did not disagree. Yes. The simplicity of that answer left no room to avoid it. Ethan let out a slow breath, his thoughts finally settling into something more structured, less reactive. If this is real, he said carefully, choosing each word with more intention now, then I cannot keep doing things the same way. Alexander watched him, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharper, more attentive. Correct. Ethan nodded once, the motion small but decisive. And this is not something I can fix with medication, he continued. Alexander's response came just as evenly. No. Ethan's chest tightened slightly at that. Not from panic, but from the weight of it. No quick solution. No immediate control. Just something that would require adjustment, time, trust. He exhaled again, slower this time, more grounded. Then we need structure, Ethan said, the word coming more naturally now. Something familiar he could build around. Parameters. Boundaries. Alexander's gaze flickered slightly, something approving passing through it before settling again. Agreed. Ethan looked at him again, more directly this time, less defensive, more certain, even if that certainty was still forming. This does not interfere with work, he added, the professional edge returning, something he could anchor himself to. Alexander's lips pressed into a faint, almost imperceptible line. It will not, he said. Ethan held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something, for any sign of uncertainty, of hesitation. There was none, just the same steady control, the same quiet certainty that his body had already recognized. And this stays contained, Ethan continued, his voice firmer now. No assumptions. No. He paused, the word catching slightly before he finished it. No escalation. Alexander did not respond immediately. He held Ethan's gaze, measuring, considering, before giving a small, deliberate nod. For now, he said. The addition was subtle, but it was there. Ethan's breath caught softly at that, not from instability, but from the quiet implication behind it. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling again, the steadiness still holding, still present, still anchored in something he was only just beginning to understand. Then we proceed carefully, Ethan said. Alexander's gaze did not waver. We proceed correctly, he replied. And for the first time, Ethan was not entirely sure those two things meant the same thing anymore. Proceed correctly. The word stayed with Ethan longer than he expected, echoing quietly as he stood there, his body still aligned. In that unfamiliar steadiness that no longer felt accidental. It felt intentional, chosen, even if he had not fully decided it yet. He exhaled slowly, shifting his weight slightly, grounding himself in the moment instead of the spiral his thoughts kept trying to pull him into. Then we start with something simple, Ethan said, his voice more controlled now, more structured, like he was rebuilding something piece by piece. Alexander did not interrupt. He waited. That alone was enough to make Ethan continue. Proximity, Ethan said. Measured. Controlled. The words came easier now, something familiar in the way he framed it, something that gave him a sense of direction again. We establish a baseline. How close? How long? What changes? Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly, not in disagreement, but in focus. You want data, he observed. Ethan nodded once. I need consistency, he corrected. Because without that, this was just chaos. And Ethan did not function in chaos. Alexander stepped slightly closer again, not abrupt, not invasive, just enough to shift the space between them into something more deliberate. Then we begin now, he said. Ethan's breath adjusted automatically, the subtle shift immediate and undeniable. His pulse steadied further, his shoulders lowering just a fraction as his body responded without resistance. He noticed it. Of course he noticed it. That was the problem. Or maybe it was the solution. He had not decided which yet. Stay there, Ethan said quickly, lifting a hand slightly, not to stop him, but to mark the distance. Alexander did not move. Ethan focused. On his breathing. On the way his body felt. On the absence of that earlier instability. This distance works, Ethan said after a moment, more to himself than anything else. He took a small step back. Just one. The shift was subtle, but there. His breath caught slightly, his pulse ticking up just enough to notice. Not overwhelming, but not stable either. Ethan frowned. That is a difference, he murmured. Alexander watched him closely, his attention precise, tracking every reaction without interrupting the process. Ethan stepped forward again, returning to the previous distance. The change was immediate. His breathing smoothed out again, his pulse settling back into that steady rhythm that felt increasingly less like control and more like alignment. He let out a quiet breath. It is not just presence, Ethan said slowly, his thoughts organizing themselves as he spoke. It is range. Alexander nodded once. Correct. Ethan glanced at him, something sharper in his gaze now, more analytical, less defensive. And duration? He asked. Alexander did not hesitate. We test it. Ethan hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Fine. He straightened slightly, setting his shoulders, preparing himself like this was any other variable he needed to measure. Time passed. Not long. Maybe a minute. Maybe two. But Ethan paid attention to every second of it, every subtle shift, every adjustment in his breathing, his pulse, his awareness. It held. Steady. Consistent. Reliable. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing further. It stabilizes, he said quietly. Alexander's gaze did not waver. Yes. Ethan looked away briefly, his thoughts catching up again, the implications settling deeper now that he had confirmed it himself. This was not temporary, not random, not something he could ignore or dismiss. It was functional, in a way that his suppressants had never been. This changes the approach, Ethan said, more certain now, less resistant. Alexander stepped closer again, just slightly, testing the boundary without crossing it completely. Ethan felt it instantly, the subtle increase in steadiness, the quiet reinforcement of what they had just confirmed. It does, Alexander agreed. Ethan's breath slowed again, his body no longer fighting the adjustment, no longer trying to reject it outright. Instead, he was learning it, adapting. The realization settled in quietly, but it stayed. Then we continue, Ethan said, lifting his gaze back to Alexander. Something steadier there now, something more intentional. Alexander met it without hesitation. We do. And for the first time, this did not feel like losing control. It felt like understanding it. Understanding did not come with relief. Not entirely. It came with weight. Ethan felt it settle into his chest as he stood there, steady in a way that no longer felt accidental, no longer felt fragile, but also no longer felt optional. It was real. That was the problem. Or maybe it was the answer. He exhaled slowly, his breath even, his pulse aligned, his body no longer fighting him the way it had at the start of the day. And yet, something deeper had shifted, something he could not undo now that he had seen it clearly. This is not just about today, Ethan said quietly, his voice more grounded than it had been all morning. Alexander did not look surprised. No, he replied. Ethan nodded once, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting again, more focused now, more certain, even if that certainty was still forming. If this continues, Ethan went on, choosing each word carefully, then this becomes long-term. The phrase lingered between them, heavier than anything else they had said so far. Alexander stepped closer again, just enough to reinforce that steady point Ethan's body had already accepted, but this time, Ethan did not track the movement with the same tension. He felt it, not as a disruption, as confirmation. It already is, Alexander said. The certainty in his voice did not leave room for doubt. Ethan's breath caught softly, not from instability, but from the quiet finality of that statement. He looked at him for a long moment, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that suggested this could still be temporary. There was none, just the same steady control, the same unwavering presence, the same thing his body had already chosen without asking him. Then we define it, Ethan said finally, his voice firming slightly, something more deliberate settling into place. Alexander's gaze sharpened, attentive. Ethan straightened, his posture aligning with the shift in his thinking, moving from reaction to intention. This does not override my autonomy, he said first, the words clear, precise. This does not remove my ability to function independently. Alexander inclined his head slightly. Agreed. Ethan held his gaze, making sure the answer was not just given, but meant. It was. He could see that now. And this does not become something else. Ethan added, the words more careful this time, less defined, but no less important. Alexander did not respond immediately. He studied him for a moment, measuring something unspoken before answering. It becomes what it needs to be, he said. The response was not what Ethan expected. It was not a refusal, not an agreement. Something in between. Something that left space for change. Ethan exhaled slowly, his chest tightening just slightly at that. Not from fear, but from the realization that this was not something he could fully control the outcome of. And maybe that was the point. He nodded once, accepting that for now, even if he did not fully understand it yet. Then we start with this, Ethan said, gesturing subtly to the space between them, to the distance they had already measured, already tested, already proven. Consistency. Stability. No sudden changes. Alexander's expression remained composed, but there was something quieter in it now, something that matched the shift in Ethan's tone. No sudden changes, he agreed. The words settled, forming the first real boundary between them that was not built on avoidance, but on understanding. Ethan felt it. The difference. The way his body responded not with resistance, but with something closer to acceptance. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering, the tension that had defined the start of his day no longer present in the same way. It was still there, but it was manageable. Different. We will need to reassess, Ethan added after a moment, his voice returning to that structured, analytical rhythm that grounded him. This is not static. Alexander nodded once. Nothing about this is. Ethan glanced at him again, something quieter in his expression now, less guarded, less reactive. Then we proceed, he said. Alexander's gaze held his, steady as ever. We proceed. The words echoed between them, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. And as Ethan stood there, steady in a way he had never experienced before, he realized something that unsettled him more than anything else that had happened today. He was not losing control. He was choosing not to force it anymore.